Hello, everybody who might be logging on and joining us. My name is Caitlin Miller. I am the Director of Education at Planet Word, and I'd like to welcome you to the Words of the Year 2022 program. Planet Word is a museum right here in downtown Washington, D.C., dedicated to words, language, and the love of reading. If you have visited us before or you are already a member, let me thank you for your support. The support of our members allows us to make the museum free and to offer programs like this one for free online. If you are learning about us for the first time or coming to us through different channels, I would like to invite you to learn more about Planet Word at www.planetwordmuseum.org. That's our website. I'd also like to make a little bit of a content advisory. Today's program is going to acknowledge human sexuality and some of the words used to describe the same. So if you're joining with some young word nerds or that doesn't sound like your cup of tea, you have been warned. But at Planet Word, we are really excited about shining the light on how language is alive and changing to meet the needs of the people who are using it. And so I'm really excited to be talking today about the 2022 Word of the Year. And today we are joined by two very exciting guests. So let me introduce our guests today. We are joined by Ben Zimmer, who is a linguist, lexicographer, and all-around word nut. He is the language columnist for the Wall Street Journal, a contributing writer for The Atlantic, and co-host of the Slate podcast Spectacular Vernacular. We are also joined by Kelly Wright, who is an experimental sociolinguist and lexicographer specializing in linguistic oppression and its institutional outcomes. She is a postdoctoral research fellow at Virginia Tech University. Zimmer and Wright work together on the American Dialect Society's New Words Committee, which is why they're the perfect guest to talk to us today. Could you start by telling us more about the American Dialect Society, how you go about selecting your word of the year and how that might have been different this year?
Sure. Happy to give a little background on what we do. In fact, I have some slides that might help tell the story a little. So the word of the year selection process actually is something that has been around since 1990. The American Dialect Society is a group that's actually, I think, 133 years old and devoted to the study of dialects of various languages in North America. But in 1990, a fellow named Alan Metcalf, who just recently passed away in February, came up with February of last year, came up with the idea of having a word of the year that would be sort of like Time's Person of the Year. And so these are the same sort of guidelines that Alan Metcalf had back in 1990. We've tried to stay true to that spirit and carry on that legacy. Words get nominated, and Kelly will be able to tell you about how we've been fielding nominations from the public, trying to open up that process. But we're looking for words that are reflecting important events, people, places, ideas, preoccupations of people in the past year. And we ask people to nominate words. They don't have to be brand new, but they have to be newly prominent. And when we say word, we're using that very broadly. As you'll see, a word can be a phrase, a compound, an expression, or even a prefix or suffix. It could happen. And so we've had a lot of fun with this over the years. It happens at the American Dialect Society's annual meeting in the first week of January. And so we not only anoint an overall word of the year, but we also have various other categories. So we pick a word that's considered most useful, most likely to succeed, most creative. Recently, we've been adding new categories like political word of the year, informal word of the year, digital word of the year. And you can see if we go back 10 years, 2012, that was the year of the hashtag, believe it or not. I'm going to run through these slides quickly just to give you a sense of the types of words that have been picked over the past decade or so. 2013 was an interesting case of something that was kind of more grammatical in nature. People using because before like a noun or an adjective, like because science. 2014, hashtag Black Lives Matter. So you saw how the word hashtag had been selected, but the hashtag Black Lives Matter was the choice for 2014 because of the importance in terms of advocacy and activism. 2015, another kind of choice that appeals to linguists, singular they, of course, having a third-person singular pronoun that is not gender specific and in fact can transcend the gender binary was the talk of 2015. 2016, dumpster fire seemed to sum up the year for reasons you may remember or would prefer to forget. 2017, fake news, which had, multiple meanings depending who you asked in 2017. 2018 was an interesting choice because it was a kind of a euphemism that was being used at the southern border, tender age shelter. And that kind of was an attempt to sort of cast a light on the way language can be used for sort of that kind of political euphemism. 2019, my pronouns are my pronouns, people talking about, identifying themselves with their pronouns. And in fact, singular they, which you saw before as the 2015 word of the year, came back as the word of the decade. When COVID hit in 2020, we had to move the whole proceedings online. And so for a couple of years, we were meeting via Zoom, and perhaps some of those in the audience tonight were able to take part in those Zoom-based word of the year selections. Not surprisingly, the word of the year in 2020 was COVID. And there were a lot of sort of pandemic-related terms that kind of dominated our attention in 2020. And then in 2021, it was a more political term, insurrection, referring to the events of January 6, 2021. Even though there were other sort of COVID-related terms like vax and long COVID, insurrection was the one to win. So on my next slide, I have some examples from this past year, but maybe I should just take a break here. But this is sort of the background, and then we can get into the things that came up for 2022 when we were actually back to meeting in person. Although it was a hybrid event, some folks were able to join as virtual attendees. Unfortunately, it wasn't as open as it was back when we were doing it via Zoom in 2020 and 2021. But we had a lot of very interesting discussion and having it sort of face-to-face meeting up again. There were a lot of sort of animated debates about the words of 2022.
Thank you very much. Actually, one of my next questions was going to be what was selected as the word of the year for 2022. So.
Okay, I'm going to advance to the next slide, and I'm going to let Kelly take over since I've been talking too much, so that we can talk about some of the words from 2022.
Great. So yeah, our word of the year for 2022 is usi or ussi. It is a suffix, or what we call a lib fix. It's a part of a word that's been liberated from its original word form. So thank you for your content warning. It's the original form is pussy. And so, but it can be applied to almost anything. The part of the reason why this word did win in our most creative category and then went on to win in the word of the year category is because of its productiveness. So it's a suffix that can essentially be added on to anything where that vowel will behave, essentially. So it was used in a lot of queer spaces, other terminology. So people who don't have a pussy would talk about their other holes as ussies, right? So you might have a bussy or a thrussy. It was used that way for a really, really long time in lots of discourse in a serious but playful way. And like a sexual way. I think Ben used like the frisson of naughtiness, that wonderful phrasing to describe like why this suffix caught on. And now online, it's been applied to essentially anything. So it's gotten out of its association with holes and gone on to just lots of fun. So in the coverage since the word of the year, we've been branded like the societussy. So it's moved well far away from whole association. But we've got lots of other really great winners in all of our categories. We had lots of really interesting categories. Our most likely to succeed, most useful was quiet quitting. And so we just or work to rule, which we might have heard before, just doing exactly what your job says. And then other nominees that were beat out for word of the year, things like Slavo-Ukrainian, dark Brandon, and Riz being a shortening of charisma. So lots of exciting things going on this year.
Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah.
So I want to like pause for a minute, because for many people, this might be the first time they're encountering this word. Maybe I'm an elder millennial and I don't spend a ton of time on TikTok. And words that are used to address sexuality or slang terms, everyone might not feel comfortable using them, especially in what we might think of as formal academic or professional settings. Have you received any sense of discomfort or pushback since the announcement of the word?
We've gotten all sorts of very interesting reactions, let's say. They're really covering the spectrum. Yeah, it's funny because, you know, sometimes we put out our announcement of what the word of the year choice is, and it's like, okay, that's interesting, moving on. That was not the case this time around. I put out just, you know, the usual tweet on the American Dialect Society's Twitter account, linking to the, you know, making the announcement, what we had selected, and linking to the press release. And it quickly went viral. I mean, just in the past, you know, the few days that it's been up, it's received, you know, tens of thousands of likes and retweets and quote tweets, and is really circulated online. And it's been very interesting just to sort of see the reaction. There are people who are kind of bemoaning the death of the English language or the death of civilization. People tend to get very hyperbolic about such things. But in general, the response that I've seen has been sort of like, I can't believe that, you know, that this funny little thing that we've been doing online has now sort of been elevated to be word of the year. And so there's kind of almost, for a lot of people, kind of pride in sort of recognizing that this kind of playful use of language that they thought might have just been in their little pocket of the internet has been noticed and is now being recognized by linguists and other language scholars. In terms of the American Dialect Society and Linguistic Society of America members who selected this, there wasn't necessarily so much concern about this being, you know, vulgar or that sort of thing. These are descriptive linguists whose job it is to talk about a language in the world the way it is, not the way that they think it should be. And so this is definitely like a phenomenon worth taking note of, you know, again, whether you think it's a bit unseemly or a bit taboo. But the fact that people took something, you know, that you know, had these original associations that Kelly described, really coming out of the LGBTQ plus community, and then just kind of running wild with it, and it showing just how a linguistic innovation like this can really have limitless productivity, and people having sort of delighting in all of that. It was something that a lot of people who you know, who voted thought should be recognized. Of course, there were other people who thought that something like quiet quitting or Slavo-Ukraini might be a more appropriate choice as kind of summing up the zeitgeist of 2022. But I think ultimately, you know, we saw some of those other examples that I showed from past years, how if something has kind of a linguistic angle to it, whether it's singular they or because followed by a noun, there's some interesting thing happening in the language. It might be the syntax or the morphology, which is how you put words together. And that's certainly the case here, where there, in fact, have already been scholarly papers written about ossification, this sort of process of sort of attaching this suffix to other words. And so linguistically, it's very rich, and I would say culturally as well. Although, of course, you know, it's something that, you know, as Kelly was saying, is really something that's taken off online, and perhaps those who are not chronically online, another one of our nominees, might not appreciate that this is happening, but I think it's definitely, you know, worth our attention.
Thank you. And, you know, I'm really glad that you touched on something else that I wanted to circle back to, that this is one of many examples of a word that might have originated or did originate in the LGBTQ community. In fact, some of the research I did indicated that this that OC has been in use in the queer community since the 90s. So there's a pattern of words developing in that community and then moving into more mainstream culture. Can you speak a little bit to how that happens and how we can go about enjoying these words as they're created, but also when does that become appropriation?
Excellent question. Yeah, so part of our process for this and for a number of the things that we document at Among the New Words, which is the dictionary arm, associated with the vote, the word of the year vote. We think we do a crowdsourcing portion for what we cover there. And so for the word of the year, we do a large period of time where people can nominate words. It's part of how we start out with our first ballot. We go into our nominating session. The WOTY process is over 2 days. The first day is a nominating session, and we go into that with a starter ballot, a working ballot that is informed by all of the nominees we get throughout the entire year at American Dialect Society. And those can come from absolutely anyone. It's not just Americans, it is open. We want to know the word of the year. It's not the English word of the year. It's not the American word of the year. It's the word of the year. And so anyone who is using words is able to tell us what they think the word of 2022 is. This is Alan, right? This is Alan Metcalf's idea, right? It's Times Person of the Year. Times Person of the Year could be any person on the planet, alive or dead, right? And so we're trying to see this. This is the same idea when we are recently also using this same process to do a gender and sexuality special edition of our Among the New Words. And we have these same questions of what do you document in gender and sexuality being this incredibly large spectrum, language that is moving very rapidly, that has moved really rapidly in our lifetimes, that is incredibly different for younger generations, that has a history that is widely undocumented. Where do we go? And we got a lot of notes from people saying, if you put this word in the dictionary, you have to make sure that you're not giving oxygen to people who use it in hateful ways. Or if you do put it in here, you have to make sure that you put these exact names in here so people do not later appropriate it. So I think that in some ways, the communities who use these words well and know them and feel them and that are part of their identities do a lot of this self-policing work to say, this is our word, here's its history, here's how you use it. So I think some of those histories that are most important to the communities that use them, they are doing the work of keeping them alive for us. So we sort of already know they're out there and they're present. I think when they aren't there and we have a question, the best way that you can do that is connecting with the community, right? And just leaving the avenues open to let them connect with you if you aren't already plugged into them.
Just to follow up on what Kelly was saying and to clarify, so when we talk about Among the New Words, the American Dialect Society has a quarterly journal called American Speech. And in American Speech, for the past 80 or so years, there has been this feature called Among the New Words, which was originally sort of conceived as a way to kind of fill in the gaps that the major dictionaries, they would only come out with their editions every several years, and this would be sort of keeping track of what was coming into the language. So Kelly and I work on that now for this journal, American Speech. And so we very often cover the nominees for Word of the Year, or sometimes, as Kelly was saying, do a special edition for instance, gender and sexuality terms and that sort of thing. And so what that allows us to do is really dig deeper and give a richer kind of cultural context for things that might come up, when we're doing something like Word of the Year, and we're just giving these very brief definitions without much contextualization. It can be, a little glib, let's say, because we're especially for people who might not be familiar with terms, for instance, these online terms that we were talking about, like OC or Riz, where you may know it again if you're a Gen Z person who's like constantly, you know, on TikTok and that sort of thing. And so what we do with Among the New Words is we flesh that picture out. We look at the history, which, as Kelly was saying, sometimes is kind of a hidden history that needs to be really recognized and not simply erased or elided if it comes from a particular, you know, subculture or community where the language sometimes, you know, whether it's like we were saying LGBTQ or African American speech, that, you know, needs to be recognized as the source for so much of things that sometimes just get labeled Gen Z slang, you know, that sort of thing. And so we try to give that sort of rich cultural contextualization in order to understand these terms better and understand where they're coming from and how they then, you know, get picked up in more mainstream usage.
So it's up to scholars and other documentarians to make sure that that heritage is being respected and reflected, and then up to all of us as users to know that as we use our language thoughtfully. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. You know, another thing that
Kelly, did you have a follow-up?
Oh, I don't want people to feel like too bad. I would say that like parts of this are, you know, the natural engines of language change, right? I mean, generations learn from each other and move together. Our society certainly like isn't the most like balanced or equitable, but we have to give ourselves like some grace for using like new words and enjoying them and sharing them amongst each other. So.
And really, I think our word of the year choice reflects that. I mean, it's really kind of people having fun with language and trying out the possibilities and trying out things that maybe sound a bit unusual, but show that in that kind of playful attitude towards language, it also, again, you know, shows how innovative and productive linguistic forms can be.
That's a really great point. I also appreciated that you mentioned Gen Z or youth culture. An interesting thing happened when the announcement was made within our staff, where I brought it up to the team, and our younger employees were like, okay, and the older employees needed it to be explained to them. So to what extent do you feel that the word of the year this year, OC, was a reflection of youth culture? And how was that incorporated into the nomination process?
Yeah, I'll say it. We circulate our survey in every place we can, right? And we encourage everyone to share it amongst folks. But the overwhelming majority of people who took the survey were younger people. And we had a large number of high school students take it as well. So we certainly had folks who were even like under 18 and taking it. So it was certainly younger. It's certainly skewed younger, our data. And you can sort of see that when you look at maybe like other words that were chosen, like, you know, some people chose like quiet quitting and inflation. The high school students don't care about inflation, right? So you can look at sort of maybe the groups of people who were choosing the words or the people who were providing the data that the other, you know, like societies used to choose their words with.
And I would say that, I mean, it's not just simply that we had, you know, a lot of young people filling out our survey, but, you know, that's kind of where the action is. I mean, that's often the case, you know, sort of the younger generation. You know, if you think about the 1920s versus the 2020s, it was the same thing. It was the young people who were sort of coming up with innovative forms and spreading it to everyone else. And so, you know, we continue to see that now, except now it's mediated through TikTok and other social media. I think that's sort of the story of, you know, the last few years in terms of what we've been looking at for Word of the Year nominees is this, you know, the role that social media like TikTok can play in terms of spreading these forms very quickly. Again, people having fun with sort of meme type formats. We recognize that in some of our other categories. We also had, for instance, an emoji of the year category, which, you know, we introduced a few years back. And these are all indications about where language is heading. And, you know, it's something that may take some getting used to for older folks. I'm from Generation X. You know, I feel like I constantly have to sort of like keep tabs with what's happening with millennials or Gen Z. my son is 16, and so he helps me out in terms of keeping track of things. But yeah, I mean, again, if we just look at some of the other examples of things that were being discussed this year, like Riz, RIZZ, although, sort of clipped from charisma, that's a term that really took off in 2022. And anyone, sort of in their 20s or younger is going to be immediately familiar with that. While older folks may possibly need to be introduced to that. But I mean, again, it's indicative again of what's kind of driving linguistic innovation these days. And yeah, a lot of that's happening online. And it's interesting too for language scholars, because we need to sort of understand that, and if we're documenting it, go to where the action is. So for that among the new words feature that Kelly and I were talking about, very often the citations that we're gathering are citations from Twitter and TikTok and Tumblr and so forth.
So young people are naturally the drivers of new words, and social media is accelerating that and has done so. I appreciate you bringing that up. I wonder, when you look across the nominations, so other words that, and you have multiple subcategories within the ballot, are there other instances where you see a clear connection to digital content, social media? Are there any other words besides USI that you want to highlight as part of that phenomenon?
Well, we could talk about snow clones, Kelly. I don't know if that might be good to talk about. So a snow clone is sort of is a term that linguists came up with to talk about phrasal templates of a certain kind, where you can take a phrase like and just kind of have slots that you fill in with various things. Like an example would be X is the new Y, and you put in different terms in that template. And that is a kind of format that people really enjoy playing with, and has a kind of like a meme-like appeal, where you sort of like, you take this format and you put something in. And so we decided, again, based on, what Kelly was describing in terms of gathering that data, that there was a whole kind of set of these phrasal templates that people seem to be using, especially online, that we created an ad hoc category for that based on what people were suggesting to us. So Kelly, you want to
It's so
talk
fun.
about some of those?
I they're so great. I really love so it's the X for me. Like it's the blank for me. That one's probably pretty recognizable to a lot of folks. She's a 10, but X. I think my favorite examples is she's a 10, but Excel thinks she's October. I like that one. She's a 10, but Excel thinks she's October. One of the ones that was, so we were thinking asking about like I guess like feedback we got, maybe like some negative feedback we got. I think one thing that happens every year that people say is that a lot of the nominees we get are like end of the year heavy, that they like trend towards the end of whatever year we're voting on. The people maybe like don't track them throughout the year, don't give us stuff early. And I would say one phrasal template that didn't do particularly well, that was doing well earlier in 2022 was like, if I text you a certain emoji or like a string of emojis, then that means another blank. Like, and so one of them was like, if I text you an accordion, like I'm gonna act accordingly. Yeah, I like that one. But what our winner was not X.
Not X. So yeah, that's one where not is kind of introducing this kind of ironic framing device, where it's not so and so doing such and such, where you're kind of expressing incredulity or mock horror at something. And that was a kind of a frame that that people were having a lot of fun with online.
I noticed that in some of the previous words of the year, other themes like politics or current events were the generators of the words of the year. Mm-hmm. To what extent was that present in the ballot this year?
Yeah, it's interesting. I almost felt like the vote this year was almost in some part a reaction against
It was.
what the heavy stuff that we've all had to deal with over the last few years. So yeah, I mean, you saw in recent years, whether it was Insurrection for 2021, COVID the year before that. I mean, the things that we've had to deal with, certainly since the beginning of the pandemic, were not so much in in the mix this year. And I think, again, people just I think wanted to look for other things, and so we didn't have so many pandemic related terms in the mix this time. And so I think that yeah, and it I don't know if Kelly, if you got the same impression, but there seemed to be kind of people just saying, let's look at some things that might be a little more lighthearted, that might be more playful. We don't have to always have word of the year candidates that are so fraught and freighted with, whether it's sort of political terms or things related to the pandemic. And so I think that was reflected in the choices.
Yeah, and we certainly choose a lot of our categories based on the nominees we receive. We have sort of a number that we like to go with, however many categories we use, but we use like the types of words we get, and then we say, what are we seeing this year? What are our categories? That's like how we ended up with phrases this time. But last year it was politics and the pandemic. We got a lot of words that were related to that. This year we had 2 nominees for long COVID and 3 for bivalent. I mean, that was essentially it for pandemic related terms. So, and I said it skewed younger. Our nominees, our nominators, skewed younger, but they just weren't the words people were putting up. So they just didn't end up in our categories. And there was opportunity for the folks who were in the live audience to be like, no, we really care about the pandemic. Like, please put all these 8 terms back up. It defines our lives and our year, but it didn't happen, right? It just didn't happen from the floor. And the same thing with politics. Like, people obviously care a lot about this word, have a lot of feelings. They feel good and bad about it. But people are never happy. They're always angry, no matter which word we'll never pick the word that will like bring, society together. But this one, the one last year, right, like got both of us like very serious hate mail, right? And so this and people in our own society were like, do not ever like make a political statement like this ever again. And we were like, we didn't do anything. Like, you all chose this word. Like, so it's like that. I think that this year people were really like, no more pandemic, no more politics. Even the political words this year are a little less politicky than
exactly. I mean, that's a good point,
times.
because what the winner for political word of the year, which was also in the mix for overall word of the year, was Dark Brandon, this kind of political meme that took the "Let's Go Brandon" right-wing anti-Biden meme, sort of using that as a sort of a euphemistic thing to say against Biden, and reclaiming it with this kind of new meme format where you have Joe Biden as this kind of all-powerful superhero type with lasers coming out of his eyes and that sort of thing. And that was an interesting kind of reclamation, because there had been what's been called dark MAGA memes and the Let's Go Brandon memes, and Dark Brandon ended up showing up when, for instance, Joe Biden had legislative success, passing his agenda, and kind of creating this kind of omnipotent, almost sinister figure that, but was actually like in a newly kind of recontextualized way of sort of taking these things. And so that was interesting that was the one that people went with, as opposed to a more kind of straightforward political term, something, or dealing with the economy or whatever. But this was another case where, even to sort of like understand what's going on with a figure like Dark Brandon, it's like, all these kind of layers of irony and, you know, a backlash against a backlash against a backlash. That's all of these things that kind of fit into it, that sort of, it's political, but at the same time, you kind of have to have this kind of awareness of the way that these kind of currents go back and forth online these days, and people, you know, take terms from the other side and reinterpret them. So I thought that was an interesting kind of demonstration of, like, you know, a political language is, you know, it's never really straightforward, but when it's put in this kind of online discourse, it can get very complex and sort of teasing apart all the different kind of connotations and resonances.
Oh, absolutely. That must be very difficult to navigate the pinning down of new words that carry context with them. I think all of the words we've talked about, that's true. And for to highlight, I'm sorry to highlight this, but Kelly, you mentioned that both of you have received hate mail based on the words of the year. Why do you think people feel so strongly about the selection of a word of the year?
Well, last year it was Insurrection. Last year it was Insurrection. It was like, it was pretty high. I'm sure, you know, and other words have just been incendiary, and they have so much, and when they're at moments, you know, and we are in like public facing jobs, I think it just it tells people they're free to say whatever they wish. And as far as the insurrection stuff, what you were saying, it is really actually quite challenging, because that was not a new word. Like, it wasn't a word itself. It was like, why is this interesting? Like, people were like, you're an idiot. Like, they were like, literally, like, you're idiots. Like, you guys don't know what you're doing. And we, if you look at the coverage in Among the New Words, our co-editor, Charles Carson, really took a lot of pains to cite it to demonstrate what we're discussing. And it is his in our citation, which are open access, they're it's minute by minute. It's like tweets minute by minute of January 6th, of the day, of people using the word, of all sorts of people from all over the place using the word. And so you can go look at our supplementary materials and actually see how like that morning unfolded online. And so we've now like documented that in a dictionary space, which is maybe not something that other, you know, places will do or have done. And we are all really grateful to Charles, because we nominated the word got nominated and picked in all of this. And then we were like, all right, have fun, like go into that nasty hate space and read every tweet, you know, for months. So it's sometimes when we do like this documentary work, or a lot of this work, where we are trying to capture what these political words are and what they're doing and how they're functioning, it really does involve sending a researcher into the nastiest places of the internet. And at times we really do have to think about, do we send them in as themselves? Because it's not always safe.
And I should just say, like, our colleagues who are lexicographers for the major dictionary publishers, Merriam-Webster, Oxford, Cambridge, and so forth, they face a lot of this too, when again, they're descriptivists, they're descriptive lexicographers talking about what's happening with the language. But when, you know, as they need to, they sort of cover hot button issues with words and revise dictionary entries to reflect current usage. They not only receive hate mail, they can receive death threats. And in fact, you know, colleagues at Merriam-Webster have had to shut the office down because of actual death threats. I mean, people take these things as kind of in a very scary direction these days. So we're sort of cognizant of that, but at the same time, yeah, I mean, that's as we were saying, it's like, you know, just the act of describing language, even if it's politically charged language, needs to be done, even if it's something that will possibly get some people riled up, just the act of describing it.
Thank you both for that. I want to take this moment to remind any of our attendees who might have questions that you are welcome to drop any questions for our panelists in the Q&A portion of the webinar. You should be able to access that. And while you're thinking about your question, I do want to point out that the American Dialect Society is, as you have mentioned, not the only entity that is documenting words of the year. What are you able to speak to what some of the other words of the year that competitor, or maybe we should say partner organizations, have chosen to highlight, and why their selections might be different in tone than the American Dialect Society's?
Yeah, it's interesting. The American Dialect Society is the oldest of the groups that announces a word of the year. A lot of these dictionary publishers have followed suit, but they very often have different criteria, different reasons for selecting a word of the year. And sometimes it's data driven. They're doing it based on looking to see what people are looking up in their online dictionaries. Yeah, so for instance, Merriam-Webster selected gaslighting, which was actually, I think, a term that you might have seen on one of my slides back from 2017, if I'm not mistaken, when we were talking about gaslighting as this kind of, psychological manipulation to get someone to doubt their reality, which ended up sort of crossing over into the political discourse in 2016 and 2017. So Merriam-Webster was noticing, not any particular incident that set it off, but that people were talking a lot about gaslighting in 2022 and looking up the word in the dictionary to try to understand what it means. Dictionary.com similarly picked woman, not because it's an unfamiliar word. It's a word that we learn when we're very young, but the fact that there were these kind of discursive battles going on about the definition of woman, and seeing how the dictionary defines it these days, and whether trans women, for instance, are identified as such in dictionary entries, and they are. I mean, that's every major dictionary sort of has that usage, because that is part of, again, describing the way the term is used these days, which of course can upset some people. So they recognize that with their term, with their word of the year. Oxford
is a prominence thing. It makes me so happy.
Exactly. Oxford actually had an interesting thing where they allowed people to vote for the first time for theirs, but they only gave them 3 choices. All 3 of them were sort of kind of online terms, though. There was hashtag I stand with X, which is another one of those phrasal templates or snow clone formats where you fill that in, with I stand with Ukraine or another cause. Metaverse, which is not a new term, but has been repurposed for Facebook's virtual reality platform. And then the winner, which I thought was the best choice, which was goblin mode, which is a term that spread online to describe basically kind of going against any kind of attempt to be, careful in your appearance or aesthetically put together, because especially since the pandemic, there have been a lot of these kind of ways of self-presentation that people might show themselves as they might show themselves on Instagram or TikTok and so forth. And goblin mode is just saying, forget all that. We're going to let it all hang out. Doesn't matter if I'm just sitting on the couch and eating junk food or whatever. I'm going goblin mode, or goblin mode activated, or various things that people were having fun with in terms of kind of pushing back against normative expectations of how you should look or how you should act. And so that was ultimately Oxford's winner after their vote among those candidates.
And then there was also a handful of others who used some different methods. So, the grammar girl, Mignon Fogarty, she ran a bracket
that was
time
a fun thing
online. And I think that hers, I mean, aside from lookups, that's data driven, that's maybe different, but hers had like the most people who opted in to maybe participate. It was
Mignon Fogarty,
people.
aka Grammar Girl.
Yeah.
She's sort of on all the different social media, and she was gathering up votes from people online and doing it in this bracket format. And I believe Quiet Quitting ended up being the winner for that one.
And that's neat. And then we also talked to some folks from the Australian societies, and they picked teal, which is a political word, and it's like a from what I understand, it's like a political party that is conservative and green.
Yeah, it's
And
like a
their
coalition.
conservative party
Yeah.
is blue, so they get
They call them, it's
together.
very confusing. They call themselves the Liberal Party, but they're actually conservative, and they're associated with the color blue. And then so blue plus green gets you teal. It's confusing, but it makes sense to Australians. So you can see
But
how,
it's
like in
neat.
different parts of the world, like, you know, different things will sort of rise to prominence and be noteworthy.
Something that has occurred to me is that we are so far have been speaking exclusively about organizations and corporate interests that document English. To what extent do you encounter this practice in any of the other global languages?
Yeah, I haven't been keeping track closely this year, but I know that there are Word of the Year selections in many different languages. I you know, know that there are ones being cast in, you know, about German, French, Japanese.
I know Irish does one.
Yeah, and even some sign languages as well. I believe there's a group based in Switzerland that does like a sort of a sign of the year as well. So so yeah, it's interesting that this Word of the Year phenomenon has you know, people have adapted it to their own situations, their own linguistic communities. Yeah, I don't have any of the winners offhand, but I do know that it's something that sometimes, again, it's dictionary publishers in various languages. Sometimes it's news organizations that are doing it as well. I think there's, like, you know, there are different sort of spins, like different spin that people may take with it. Like there's like a German youth Word of the Year, that sort of thing. So yeah, as Kelly was saying, you know, we don't, you know, limit ourselves necessarily to English, but, you know, and we do have obviously things like Slava Ukraini, which crossed linguistic boundaries this year. You know, literally means glory to Ukraine, but was taken up internationally for, you know, to express solidarity with Ukraine.
Thank you. I think it's probably fair to say that the American Dialect Society's Word of the Year out of all of these probably has and I'm going to try to borrow your term here, the greatest frisson of naughtiness.
Frisson.
Frisson,
I don't know
thank
how
you.
everyone pronounces it. Yeah.
Is there a reason? I mean, is it fair to characterize your selection process as less bounded by some constraints than maybe a dictionary?
That seems fair to say. I mean, again, yeah, we're not running this through some, you know, publicity and marketing teams to decide what's gonna be best. I used to work as a lexicographer for Oxford University Press, and I'm familiar with how that works. It's like you have the editorial side and the marketing side, and it's like, let's come together and find something that's going to work to kind of represent our brand, that sort of thing. So with the American Dialect Society, again, it's, you know, it's what people vote for, and if that happens to be USSI this year, and when people want to talk about Ussification, that's fine. We're not doing it as some sort of like branding effort. So we do have fewer, you know, restrictions or inhibitions in terms of that, and we're not, you know, while the dictionary folks are very often sort of thinking about, well, you know, what does this say about what we do? So just like as another interesting example, Cambridge University Press puts out Cambridge dictionaries, and they also do this kind of data-driven thing by looking at what people look up, and they chose Homer because that was actually a word that appeared as the answer word for Wordle. And these days, people are just sort of looking up Wordle words quite a lot, those 5-letter words. And the day that Homer was the answer word,
like an international incident.
It became an international incident. Yeah, UK folks were distraught because this Americanism, a homer, you know, as a term meaning a home run in baseball, was not something that they were familiar with, and there was all of this talk about whether Homer should have been a word that Wordle used. but they decided at Cambridge that they were going to have that be their unusual kind of word of the year, in part to sort of comment on the whole Wordle phenomenon and the way people are using dictionaries these days, often for, this very popular word game, but also to kind of show, talk about differences between British and American English, because Cambridge encompasses both. They have American and British dictionaries available. And so that was a way for them to sort of talk about these major varieties of English and the way people can sort of argue in this kind of transatlantic argument over terms. So, again, people have these sort of word of the year choices and they all sort of bring something different to the table, but that's fun. I think it's interesting. You can have so many different possibilities as your word of the year.
Absolutely. In fact, I seem to recall that the suffix dull coming out of Wordle was also an option this year.
Yes, in fact, it won in our sort of our digital word of the year category. And much like Ussi, it's as Kelly was saying, it's a lib fix. So that's that's a term that the linguist Arnold Zwicky came up with. Mm-hmm. So basically, we are often blending words together, but then occasionally one of these blend components can sort of take on a life of its own. It can become liberated. So it just starts off as a part of a word, but now kind of stands in for the word. If you think of like how Watergate spawned gate for any scandal, right, that sort of thing. And so both Ussi and Dole illustrate that. So when Wordle took off, it was actually created by a fellow named Josh Wardle, who just changed a vowel in his name to get the name of the game Wordle. When that took off, there were all these copycats. And so, you may have seen Quordle or Semantle or Redactyl or Absurdle or Hurdle, and they all have that sort of similar ending to let you know, okay, this is a guessing game for, it could be Name That Tune or some other type of format, but it's an online guessing game where you try to like narrow down something to the correct answer, and so Dole ended up just DLE or some part of the end of Wordle just became this sort of recognizable suffix.
I realize that we're nearing the close of our time together. So I want to once again offer our guests the opportunity to ask any questions that they would like, either in the chat or the Q&A, and offer Ben and Kelly the opportunity to say, is there anything important about this conversation you think we're missing or haven't covered already tonight?
Well, I mean, we could talk about some of the other interesting nominees that came up. So, I mean, we already talked about quiet quitting, which one is most useful / most likely to succeed, dark brand and political, Dole as digital. We also had a whole informal word of the year category. And this again is a category where that kind of online usage really comes to the fore. And so, Kelly, maybe you could speak to the winner in that category, which was It's Giving.
And also, and informal, your question, maybe going back to is it appropriation? I think our the way we have maybe oriented ourselves to that category has changed. So it used to be called slang, and we don't call it that anymore. We call it the informal word of the year, because calling it slang, it gives it a sort of a judgment of how we feel about it, instead of saying that it's less than, or it's not as important, or we think it comes from different places. So we're just saying it's not a formal word. It's our informal word of the year, instead of, putting it into a box. And so a lot of these words definitely come from online spaces, but It's Giving is goes back, decades into drag and ballroom culture. It certainly comes out of a community and has then, over time been picked up with, drag culture going mainstream and being just something that everyone is used to now. And then these bits of discourse becoming part of what all younger people are using, and now everyone online is using. So you can just say It's Giving. The X itself is optional. These things used to be whole phrases, then got shortened part of the reason why they're interesting and our winners is because they've gone through these like long histories of linguistic processes that affect lots of different words and phrases.
Yeah,
It's
so with its giving, it's interesting too, because again, someone, might more typically
giving
say
Wody.
you might say, oh, this is giving me a Wody vibe or something like that. But then you can just kind of compress that into just saying it's giving Wody. So it's giving blank, rather than saying it's giving me a blank vibe or whatever. It's just this kind of almost elliptical way of saying it. You're leaving out a bit, but it's understood what you're saying. It's implicit. And if you understand that kind of format, and you can get even more elliptical just by saying it's giving without anything following it. So that's another kind of interesting linguistic process that happens with words and phrases that become, as Kelly was saying, I mean, it could come out of a particular subculture, like in this case, sort of drag culture, but then get picked up on as kind of a fun new way of saying things in a way that kind of relies on our shared knowledge of the way that these things work. And so if you're familiar with it, then you kind of feel in the know. And that's another thing that kind of gives these terms cachet online, is sort of, you feel like linguists talk about sort of in-group identity. You feel like you're in the group that knows how these terms work. And so that was a fun choice that we had in that particular category, which also featured Riz, which we talked about earlier.
Can I talk about OC just for another second?
Is there an important point about OC that we have missed?
I just think that I think it's really important to think about that it's positive. I know that maybe a lot of people are not comfortable saying the word that it comes from, like even people who have one, and that it may be hard for a lot of older folks to say. I think that it's really great that people are even just talking about that part of a person's body and like using it in a really positive way. We can maybe think about other older terms that like man boobs, that refer to like feminized body parts on not women and aren't good, that people have been playful with, but still had a not, and this isn't that. This is fun. People are having fun with this term. And I think that's like what I want to leave people with, is that it's playful.
And I think that you have hit on an excellent way to send out the evening, that language is such a playful place for us to innovate and describe new phenomenons and grow and change. And this conversation tonight has helped highlight all of the ways in which language is alive. And for that, I would like to thank you both so much. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Kelly, for joining us tonight to talk about language and the 2022 words of the year. If you would like to learn more about Kelly or Ben, perhaps, do you have social handles you'd like people to visit you on?
Sure. Yeah. So the American Dialect Society website is at americandialect.org. And then you can also follow us on Twitter at the handle is American Dialect. You can also find us on Facebook as well. So if you go to the website, then you will find the press release with all of the nominated words and how people voted on them. And you can also learn about becoming a member of the American Dialect Society if you'd like to join in this, which actually gets you a subscription to that journal, American Speech, that we were talking about. And so if you want to learn more, there's plenty there to keep you busy.
Well, thank you very much. And if anyone would like to learn more about Planet Word, then you can join us at www.planetwordmuseum.org. And with that, thank you all so much. Have an excellent rest of your night.